So we're working out our points here. We've got a very good context here, getting our points for contextualization. We got our thesis statement. Here just a moment, we'll talk about what we need to do to get that outside information point. But the bulk of our paper, 3 of the 7 total points that are available to us, is going to come from our body paragraphs. And so I'm going to walk you through what you need to do in a body paragraph and how that should look. I'm going to do this for our category here that says that communist movements did not do very much to affect the women's rights movements in the 20th century or affect women's struggle for rights in the 20th century. We can apply this to any argument that we're making. Okay? You may not be surprised that we need to start off a body paragraph in an essay that is an argument by having a topic sentence. And a lot of times people want to get fancy with these, but you don't have to be fancy. The rubric's very clear with what it asks for. And the reason we're putting a topic sentence here is because the whole point of this essay is to prove our thesis. We have to prove that we are giving a valid answer to the question. The question is, to what extent did communist movements affect the struggle for women's rights? And so we have to give them 3 different answers, and then we need to support it with our documents. So as much as I'd like to just, for my topic sentence here, type out not much, that's not a good topic sentence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the prompt of the question and restate it using my answer or my group. All right, so I'm going to type it like this. Communist movements in the 20th century did not have a very significant effect on women's struggle for rights. Oh, I guess that's the effect. Effect. You know how that is, right? Okay, but what I'm also going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and list the document numbers. And if you want a pro tip, if you underline the document numbers, especially in your topic sentences, it's going to help the reader locate document numbers, and you always want to be on your reader's good side. So I've told what my category is going to be about, what my argument is going to be, and I'm just going to put this in. As shown in documents 1, 4, and 7. Notice that I spelled them out, and I'm going to underline those guys. And so there's my topic sentence. The next thing I do is I'm going to go into document 1, and we're going to use the Guatemala paper here to see what we have to do for document 1. We'll do the same thing for document 4 and the same thing for document 7. Then we go right to the next paragraph. Start with a new topic sentence, and I can tell you exactly what my topic sentence is going to be for the next paragraph. It's going to be communist movements in the 20th century had a significant effect through laws on women's struggle for rights as shown in documents 2 and 3. And then I'm going to go on and do the same thing for those documents. I'll do the same thing for the last group, and then we'll move on to our wrap-up paragraph. This is definitely, guys, a 5-paragraph paper. And following the Guatemala paper, you can't go wrong. All right? So let's move on down and see what we have to do for the documents. Well, the first thing we have to do is prove how it supports our thesis. And that's going to ask us to go back to the documents. So let's start with document 1. document 1, and how does it support our thesis? Well, let's go back and look at what the document is. Okay, this was about the veiling, right? No, that was document 2. Document 1 was about how she was a woman in the Russian Communist Party, a member of the Bolshevik government. And she's talking about how she's frustrated with communism, and that communism is not helping women in Russia. It leads to they need a new social order. And they need, how did she say this? Women's liberation can only take place only as the result of a new social order and a different economic system. I had above all set myself to the task of winning over women workers for Russia to socialism, and at the same time of working for the liberation of women for the equality of rights. Could only take place as a new social order. Okay, so we are at a point now where we're going to work this in and say that they didn't have a very strong effect. So can we do that using this document? Sure. She's talking here about how she was a woman. She was popular as an orator. And she says right here. Oh. In the period, I realized for the first time how little our party had concerned itself with the fate of women, of the working class, and how meager was its interest in women's liberation. So, the thing we don't want to do here is quote. Quoting documents is the biggest waste of time because it doesn't prove that you know what the document means, what it says, or that you're making an argument. Let's go back to the rubric and let me show you what I mean. So the rubric here says to get 2 of the evidence from documents points, and that's what I'm shooting for here. We have to support an argument in response to the prompt using at least 6 documents. And it says to earn 2 points, the response must accurately describe, rather than simply quote, the content from at least 6 documents. In addition, the response must use the content of the documents to support an argument. All right, so we have to describe the document and we have to use it to support an argument. If we just quote it, we're doing neither of those. All right, so we're back here looking at the document and what it says, and we're looking at what we're putting in our Guatemala paper for how does it support our thesis. That's the argument we have to make with the document. So we're going to say something here like document 1, which is a quote from a member of the Bolshevik BOLS party in 1926, shows a leader and speaker who was, what's a good word to say this? Who was disappointed. That's a word I usually misspell, but got it right. It shows a leader and speaker who was disappointed with her party's respect for the liberation of women. Okay? Is that a good summary of what the document is saying? Okay? Now, I have to come right out and say how this supports my thesis. Okay? So I'm going to say something like this. though it shows support for women that a female leader was allowed to practice in the Communist Party. I should probably capitalize communist because it's the name of the party in Russia. The fact that she was, I don't want to say disappointed again, so I'll say disconcerted with the efforts of her party's view towards women shows that at least in the USSR in the early 1920s, or in the 1920s, or let's say in the early 20th century, some women were not seeing support from, or let's say not seeing very much support from communist movements. Okay. So there we're in a place where we have described the document, and this is really what you should do. You should describe, and then you should TTT, tie it to your thesis. And you should do this for every document. And then there's one more thing we have to do for a document to make sure we get a good score on the rubric, and it is sourcing. The rubric calls it analysis and reasoning. For at least 3 documents, explain how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, and or audience is relevant to the argument. So most students read this and say, if I say who wrote this document, I get the point in 3. No, that's not what it says. It says you have to tell how or why the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or audience is relevant to the argument. And this is this is something that a lot of students struggle with. So the first thing I want to tell you about is this program called HIP. And if you'll see here, I have it written across on the Guatemala paper. So how are we going to source it? Are we going to talk about the historical context of the document? That means what was going on around the time the document that was written. Are we going to talk about the intended audience? Who was it written for? Are we going to talk about the purpose? Why it was written? Or are we going to talk about the POV, the point of view? Who wrote it and why'd they write it? So here's where we stand. We stand at a point where coming up with these things is kind of easy. But figuring out why it matters, why it is relevant to an argument, that's where it's hard. So let's look at who wrote this document. Well, it was a female leader of the Bolshevik government in the Soviet Union. She has a first-hand account of what women are facing in the USSR and what the government is doing in the USSR. That's pretty obvious. So when we look at this document, I think the best thing for us to talk about is this author's point of view. Okay? And we're going to say something like this. As a woman leader in the Soviet Union, Alexandra Kollontai has had a first-hand account of not only how women were treated in the movement, but the interworkings of the USSR. Interworkings. Is it inner workings? There we go. Inner workings of the USSR and how they might use the government to help women. From this point of view, it is clear that this was not happening, according to Kollontai. Notice that I used her first and last name the first time I mentioned her, and any other time I mention her in the paper, I'm just going to refer to her as the last name. Okay? So now I have sourced document 1. I have said who wrote it, the POV. I said, and I've talked about why who wrote it matters to the argument. Basically what I'm doing is saying, look at this person. They support my argument. And my argument here is that the government, the communist movements didn't do much to affect women's struggles for rights. Okay? Let's look at the next document. And so what I'd like to show you is when I take these 3 things that I've done, I've described the document, I've tied the document to thesis, and I've sourced the document. I'm now done with that document. If I do that for the other 6, I'm walking out of here with a 6 or a 7. And that's a really good score. All right. Now, I know this looks like a big gob of words, and it is, but I'm just checking off the boxes as I go. So now, let's move on to our next document, which, if we go back to the Guatemala paper, is document 4, where, this was the table that showed that there were not a lot of women increasing in professional organizations in the USSR in the 1940s and 50s. So now we're going to do the exact same thing we did for document 1. So we're doing document 4. And we're going to first say, how does it support our thesis? I'm going to go back up here and underline my use of my document there. So I'm going to start it the same way. I don't have to be fancy. I don't have to change this up. All I have to do is take off and go. Okay, so I'm going to say document 4, which is a table of information from the National Science Foundation in the United States from 1961, shows that between the years of 1947 and 1959, women did not see much of a rise in high-level jobs. That should be hyphenated. For example, they did not see an increase in the percentage of women holding doctoral degrees over the time period. And saw increases of 2%, well, let's spell that out, 2% for professors, 3% for associate professors, and so on. Let's not say and so on. And similar, very small growths across the board. So we have described this document and said what it says. Okay? So how does this support our thesis? So I'm going to go right on to how does it support. Here is my describe. Here is my title thesis. I can even say this proves that many communist governments did not have much of an effect. I always mess those up. Have much of an effect on effect on the struggle for women's rights during the 20th century, because it shows that the world's strongest and most powerful communist nation did not see a rise in female professionals. Okay, so now we're in a spot where we have a title thesis that says this is why, this proves that they didn't really have much of an effect. Now we go down to sourcing. If you remember when we read this earlier today, we said that we need to question the author because this is the Cold War. All right. So what I'm going to do, and it's totally okay for me to do this, is I'm going to try to poke a hole in my own argument here and question how this is written, why this is written, and basically throw some shade at the American government here, which is always good in AP World History. So I'm going to say something like this. Since this is a publication of the NSF from Washington, D.C., it's a lot of commas and periods there. One could question the motive of its publishing. While engaged in the Cold War with its subject for the study, the U.S. government may have chosen years where women's achievements were lower. For example, one might ask why the years 1947 through 1959 were chosen. It could be possible that dates outside of that time frame, for example, comma, showed a more favorable increase for the statistics. Okay, so now I have sourced the document. I've told why it might matter to our thesis. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe we can look at 1937 to 1947 and we see a jump from 0% to 29%. That's a huge jump. Maybe I could go in and talk about how 30% of the PhD holders in Russia in the 40s and 50s were women. That's pretty good. I wonder how that compares to today. So now what we've done is we have sourced, tied a thesis, and described two of these documents. And in order to save time, we're going to kind of call that a day for the way these documents work. Okay. I would suggest that you go take the rest of these documents and see what kind of argument you can put together. And again, it's totally fine to start with the same format for your topic sentence, the same format for your description, and the same format for your title thesis and your sourcing. It doesn't have to be pretty. Remember, the readers at the end of the year are viewing this as a rough draft. So as long as you do these things, you will get the points.